Welcome, everybody, to Two Pals and a Pod. Since April 2023, Sudan has been engulfed in a fierce power struggle between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. After months of siege, last week, the paramilitary RSF captured El Fasher, previously the last major stronghold of the Sudanese armed forces in the Darfur region. Our social media feeds were filled with live stream atrocities committed by the RSF. Mass killings, rapes, and abductions, as the RSF pushed the Sudanese army out of the city. According to the UN, the conflict in Sudan is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and the situation on the ground is deteriorating rapidly. Aid agencies say around 200,000 people remain trapped in El Fasher. They're living in desperate conditions, running out of food and water. Tens of thousands of others, mostly women and children, have fled on foot. Look, despite being described as the worst humanitarian crisis with famine, mass displacement, and collapsing infrastructure, Sudan has struggled to grab global attention. And those of us in the Palestine liberation movement know that our struggles are connected and that justice is indivisible. Ignorance is not an excuse, and we have a duty to learn and act. And for this reason, today, Two Pals in a Pod is delighted and honoured to have the amazing Yassmin Abdel-Magied on our show for kind of like an emergency one-on-one primer on the situation in Sudan. Yassmin Abdel-Magied is a Sudanese Australian writer, recovering mechanical engineer, award-winning social advocate, who writes and speaks on politics, society, culture, and technology. And she joins us from the UK, where she's now based. Welcome, Yassmin.
Thank you, Nanda. Thank you for having me.
Look, I want to first start with world building for you to kind of paint a picture for us of Sudan, its people, its geography, its culture, its vibe, what you love about it, because we're going to get to the horrors of what is happening. But part of the problem, surely, is that most people's stereotypes and presumptions about Africa are always through this image of deficit, of war and loss, and anti-Black education systems and cultures produce this massive, deliberate blind spot, almost as though it's Africa, the fatalistic idea that they're just always meant to suffer. So I want you to tell us the Sudan that you know and love, and build us a little bit of a picture so that audiences can, give this podcast some context for what we're talking about and where we're talking about.
Someone recently said to me that Sudanese people are Ahl vibes. Which for those who don't speak Arabic, essentially it's kind of like they're like the people of vibes, like Sudanese people, for me, are some of the most chill, the most relaxed. I mean, the irony is that, we're talking about all these horrific kind of things, but also if you ever sit with a group of Sudanese people, one thing you will definitely do is you'll have tea, you'll have shay. Shay bi mazaj is also another thing that we do a lot, which is essentially tea with chilling, like tea with hanging out, like tea with nothing at all. People are always like, oh, you need to do self-care. I'm like, self-care. Sudanese people have been doing self-care. Yeah. Like we've been doing collective self-care since day dot. So to take it back, like when we think about what Sudan is and the kind of construction of Sudan today, it's helpful to kind of think, historically as well. Right. And people are aware of the sort of ancient Egyptian history and so on. But often what people don't realize is that what you consider Nubia and what people might consider Nubia in Egypt is actually also Sudan, right? That kind of border between Egypt and Sudan is an artificial one. And so you've kind of got a variety of kingdoms. You had the kingdom of Kerma, the kingdom of Kush. You had these incredible, quite often matriarchal civilizations. When talking like 2000 plus BC, and the civilizations, the sort of base of the foundation of what Sudan is today kind of comes from that. A lot of language, a lot of sort of like cultural mixes. This was an area of great trade, an area of great like ethnic mixing and so on. So Sudanese people also tend to be, quite mixed in terms of ethnicity and so on, quite mixed with languages as well. Even though Arabic is the official language, that's an Arabization thing of, more modern times. There are over 100 indigenous languages. And I think the other thing that's useful to think about when it comes to Sudan is, yes, it is the desert, but it also is like the kind of landscapes are quite incredible. And I will, I'm happy to sort of share links to kind of videos and so on, because you've got the Red Sea, Sudan borders the Red Sea, and if you're into diving, it's got like some of the most pristine. Our tourism isn't that big at the moment, and so it's a very untouched coastline in terms of diving and so on. So like some of the best diving in the world, some of the most sort of preserved coral reefs and so on, all the way across to like Darfur. And of course, it used to be a much bigger country. The country split in 2011, but the south is incredibly vibrant. It's green, it's lush. And so when you come to Sudan, and inshallah, all of you will have an opportunity to one day come to Sudan, what you'll definitely be greeted with is far too much enthusiasm and friendliness. People are, like, it is not a joke when they say that they will give you the last bit of food that's, in their house, and they will sleep on the floor rather. And actually, my aunt tells the story. Most of my family has been displaced now, and they sort of traveled all across Sudan. And at every point when they were being displaced, and this is kind of happening across the country, people opened their homes up, they opened up their communities, they fed each other, they looked after each other. We are a very collectivist people. We are a people who the sense of looking after one another is like, I can't conceive of a Sudanese person who doesn't have that in their kind of DNA. So yeah, that gives a bit of a sense, hopefully.
Yeah, it's beautiful you say all that, and I can definitely like it's very relatable. My son's best friend is Sudanese, his teacher's Sudanese. We've got another very small community in the Islamic school my children attend, of Sudanese people, and they're all of them, like you said, that vibe definitely is something
Exactly.
that yeah.
Let me tell you, there was, just another small story. So I grew up in Brisbane. My family was one of the first Sudanese families that we know of in Brisbane. And the next one didn't come till like 10 years later. But we heard that there was a Sudanese family coming. So of course we went to the airport to greet them. Did we know them? No. My dad like had just heard through a friend. We didn't even have WhatsApp at this point, right? But somehow, somewhere, there was like a Sudanese person coming. My dad was like, go pick them up. Like that's the kind of sense of, community and generosity, I think, that exists in Sudan.
And this is really basic, but can you give us just because obviously when we're talking about what's happening in Sudan, it's the geopolitics, and geopolitics comes back to geography. Where is Sudan located in terms of, the Middle East, in terms of Africa, just so people can paint a picture in their mind?
Yeah. I think it's actually useful to understand that Sudan's geography is a big part of its kind of geopolitical importance, right? Because it sits at the intersections of lots of different places. So it kind of sits south of Egypt. It's got like Chad and Libya to the west. You've got Eritrea, Ethiopia, so on to the east. You've also, as I said, you've got the Red Sea, and across the Red Sea, you've got Saudi, Yemen, so on. And then in the south, obviously, you have South Sudan. You've got a little bit of the Central African Republic would be South Sudan. So you've got quite a lot of neighbors, right? But also, people have sometimes called Sudan as like the gateway to sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that framing, but the idea is that you've kind of got the influence of the sort of Arab North Africa, right? And that kind of connection with the Gulf and the Middle East, as we would call it, as well as the Sahel. So if you kind of go across, if you look west, you've kind of got all of these Chad, Libya, etc., all of these Sahel countries. And then you've also got in the south, the sort of like, as we say, sub-Saharan, or kind of like culturally, there is a distinction between kind of the north and southern parts of Africa, and Sudan is kind of the transition between those worlds, right? And so this also means that you're kind of like at the intersection between lots of different kind of communities, lots of different regional interests. This is why, for example, the United States has kind of in the past had a policy of being like, in fact, there was the policy was essentially about investing in South Sudan as a sort of Christian country, as a bulwark against the Islamization and Arabization of, Africa broadly, right? Or you've kind of You've got lots of countries being interested in that kind of like Red Sea coastline, like Russia. Loads of other countries have been interested in like setting up military bases there that because it's in such like a key area. And then you've kind of got the Sahel, which has lots of different kind of challenges. And it's also a part of the world that is like, there aren't so many people living. If you think about the map of Africa and you kind of think of that top, the sort of chunky bit at the top there, it's not hugely densely populated. So lots of stuff goes on there, and there's lots of migration through there. There's lots of movement through there, but it's also not necessarily, strictly under any particular, government control or anything like that. And so a lot of, again, European and Western countries kind of look at it as a quote unquote problem area. And there are challenges and so on. But again, that's a way that sort of, connects Sudan to, let's say, like geopolitical interests.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think understanding that it's at this intersection of lots of different regions, and it's also a place that has traditionally, I mean, Darfur used to be its own kind of empire. Like we often hear about it now as this kind of place of unfortunate massacre and genocide, but it was the Darfur Empire was huge and powerful. And it was because of its position. It was because it was at the intersection of all these other things. And of course, I can't neglect to mention the Nile, right? That great tributary that kind of goes up through the center of Sudan. The White Nile and the Blue Nile meet in Khartoum, which is where I was born, and then goes up to Egypt. But that Nile is also means that there's like great agriculture. Sudan is incredibly, despite it being a desert, but like despite lots of it being sort of desert Sahara, the Nile is like means that there's incredible arable land, and we'll come to talk to this later. And that's some of the land that people and other foreign interests are invested in. But it's a place that like Sudan is incredibly resource rich, also because it's at the intersection of all these things. People have kind of understood and realized over time there is like, not only is there land that is very fertile, but there's things like gold, and there's things like oil, and there's all of these different resources that make Sudan a very rich country. And historically, the people of Sudan have been able to, to invest that wealth in themselves, but over time that wealth has been extracted.
That's a fantastic, fantastic introduction, I think, because people often just they want to understand what's happening, but at a surface level, and fail and neglect to understand the geopolitics is absolutely linked to the geography and the resources and
Right.
like you said, the locality of a place. So thank you so much for unpacking that. Can you give us a brief overview of what's happening in Sudan right now, in particular the siege of Al-Fashir?
So I'll tell you what's happening right in this moment, and then I'll give you a bit of background so that you can understand what's happening in context. So Al-Fashir is the capital of North Darfur. Darfur is the big western state. As I said, it's sort of Chad and Libya are on the west there, so that's the big state there. And the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, have been slowly overtaking Darfur, and that's kind of where they've always been. That's kind of their base area. They've been slowly overtaking it since the beginning of the war in April 2023. But Al-Fashir was the last place that was holding out. And, the Sudanese armed forces were there, but also the people themselves were kind of holding out. But it was a really difficult situation. There was a siege, which essentially means there was like a wall had been built, like out of mud, out of earth, had been built around Al-Fashir to keep people in. And it got to the point, like we were hearing stories where there was literally no food left, and there was no way for food to get into the city.
Was this for about 18 months, that siege?
Yeah.
And how many people
So
approximately, Yassmin, were in Al-Fashir?
So
besieged?
Before the war started, there was over 1 million people. The numbers are sort of saying like between 800,000 to like 250,000. So we're talking a lot of, like, it's a big range, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of people were in Al-Fashir. And like if you think 250,000 people who are stuck in a small area, unable to leave, unable to get food, unable to get support. Just imagine all the things that happen in that time. People fall sick, people get pregnant, people, like it's 18 months, it's over 500 days. People were trying to live their lives. People were resorting to eating leaves and grass and anything they possibly could. And then what we saw over the last week or so was the rapid support forces broke that siege, and they came into the town, and they do what they always do, which is, um, you know, have a systematic policy of massacre, and rape and looting and so on. We don't still yet have numbers,
Yeah.
for how many people have been killed. Your listeners might know that the massacres are so bad that the pools of blood could be seen from space, right?
Yes.
And I urge you to think about how much that has to be for something to be seen from that far away. And so, we're talking in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, in the space of, a week. And this is still ongoing. This hasn't stopped. It's not like the RSF is done. It's not like, in fact, all they're doing is now pushing to other parts of Sudan. They're clearing out Al Fashir and moving to other parts. We know that a few thousand were able to escape on foot, walking 50 plus kilometers to get to nearby areas like Tawila and so on, small villages that don't have the capacity, that they themselves have been struggling. That if you think that the other thing I should say is, like, this is Al Fashir. This is one massacre that has happened. A similar thing happened in Al Junaina, last year, where, similarly there was a place where a lot of people had come to escape. A lot of people, because Al Fashir was one of the last place that people could come to escape, the kind of violence that had been in Darfur in other parts. And so a lot of people in Al Fashir had also been displaced numerous times, right? This was the kind of last spot. But in Al Junaina, they killed over 15,000 people in the space of a few days. Imagine, think of how many people 15,000 people is. That's like half a stadium, just like murdered over the course of a few days. And so
I like that you used the stadium analogy. I that's the way I imagine the numbers out of Gaza, because we're living in this ridiculous sporting culture here. And every time, I take my kids, the only thing I can see and measure is the scale of numbers, and then I measure it against the death tolls. And it really brings home the desensitization and complete lack of care, and acknowledgement of the scale of how much black and brown bodies are just dispensable and disposable.
Yeah. Let's use another example. There were reports that 460 people in a hospital, patients and doctors, were murdered. That's talking maybe like every single AFL player. If you put them all in one place, that might be a couple of hundred. Or maybe every single like rugby football player in Australia. If you put them all in one room and then murder them all, that's the kind of that's the numbers we're talking about. And you think 460 in the scale of 15,000, in the scale of a few 100,000, right? I think it's, I think it's difficult for us to understand actually what that experience is like, right? And I think it's trying to find different ways to kind of communicate, and you have this experience with Gaza, right? Trying to find different ways to communicate the kind of like depravity of what's going on. And the other thing that, we should talk about is the fact that it's not as if there are like loads of journalists on the ground. The videos that we're seeing from Al Fashir are those posted by the perpetrators themselves, right? We're seeing satellite images and we're seeing videos posted by the perpetrators where they're laughing.
Yes.
Laughing as they're killing people, right? And so the question is, how do we get to this place, right? How do we get to a place where there is a militia, wiping people out in these sort of mass numbers? And so this is where I'll take a step back and say that in Sudan, the way I describe what's going on is that it's a war against civilians. It's a counter-revolutionary war.
Yeah.
And why is it really important to understand this? Because in 2018-19, there was this incredible revolution. It was a peaceful, non-violent revolution where the Sudanese people successfully overthrew a dictator of 30 years, Omar al-Bashir, and managed. And the call is very simple. We want a civilian government. We want the military back in the barracks, and we want a civilian government. We want to kind of lead ourselves. Khalas, done with the oppressive regimes. And so 2019, we saw this kind of successful revolution. And then what we had was this kind of transition period where there was like a council that was part military, part civilian. They came together and they said, okay, we're going to have like a couple of years of transition and then we'll hand over to the civilian government. What happened in 2021 was when the military had to hand over, they were like, actually, maybe we don't want to do that. Maybe actually, it's always the transition period, right? It's always the transition period. They're like, maybe we don't want to do that. And so there was a coup, right? And the head of the RSF, Hemeti, and the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, Burhan, worked together to essentially overthrow the civilian movement. And here, the international community, rather than being like, that seems like a bad idea, the international community was like, oh, okay, I guess that's what's going to happen. And it goes back to this idea that, oh, it's just Africa. It's just another country in Africa. They love their military leaders, whatever. Every single civilian actor, every single civil society group was like, don't listen to these guys. They're lying. They are murdering genocide, yes. But people allowed it to go forward. A deal was made. And then you had these two generals, Hemeti and Burhan. And what we're seeing now is sometimes described as a battle between these two generals. But actually, the better way to think about it is that it is a punishment for the civilians for daring, for having the audacity to have a revolution and to succeed, right? It is a punishment for the it's punishing the civilians for their revolution. And this is one of the messages that I always want to tell people is that look at Sudan, because what happened was the Sudanese people did the thing. They overthrew their dictator, but the international community, but they couldn't do everything on their own. They needed support. They needed the international. We do live in a world where the international community has to support the civilians, but they found it, the community found it too difficult. The diplomats found it too difficult. And now we're in this situation where, lots of everything that is happening is against the interests of the Sudanese people. Yeah. Right. So I really urge people not to think about this as a civil war, but to think about it as a war against civilians and to see it as a cautionary tale for what happens when you don't support civilian movements after a revolution.
I love that, Yassmin, because all we're hearing is it's a civil war, which then reduces it to this fatalistic idea where they just don't get along. It's just what Africans and Black and brown people do. And what you're talking about is how it's a betrayal of civilians, exercising their agency, wanting to empower themselves. And that betrayal is by both the RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces in the beginning. So that collaboration now has led to this where it's perceived as, so there's still two warring groups now?
Yeah. Okay. And I think in this moment, what I'll do is also really caution people about some of the misinformation and disinformation that's kind of floating around, right? Because what both groups understand is that there is the war on the ground and then there is the war in the information space. And they're both doing a lot to try to bring people onto their side. So the RSF, for example, Hemeti has literally hired PR companies, one of which was like, I think founded by an Israeli based in Canada. So there's but Hemeti, who's the head of the RSF, who, by the way, was involved in the RSF. Let me just take a quick step back. It didn't come out of nowhere, right? It actually came out of the army, the Sudanese Armed Forces, in the early 2000s, because Umar al-Bashir wanted somebody to deal with the problem in the West, to deal with the rebels in the West. And so he let this small group kind of deal with that problem. That group was called the Janjaweed, and dealing with the problem ended up being the Darfur genocide of 2003, 2004, 2005. So the RSF has form, right? But, and then they started out as the Janjaweed, they committed that genocide, then they started getting some rebranding, right? They got renamed a couple of times, and then they got called the RSF, got made into a formal kind of paramilitary group, and then were made part of they were kind of like an addendum to the armed forces, right? Almost kind of like that group that does things that you don't want to say you're actually doing. Yeah. And so part of the reason they now, this might be too much context and you feel free to cut it out. But part of the reason they started fighting in April was because the army was like, all right, it's time for you to be absorbed into the army, right? Like you've had your fun now, but time to be absorbed. And Hemeti, well, he's an ambitious man. And what he had been doing over the past 20 years is had been all the gold and all the resources that we've been talking about, he'd been making it his personal wealth, right? And he'd been creating his own little kingdom out there in the West. And so he was like, no, why should I give all of the power that I've accrued away? I should actually be the one running the show. So that's some kind of side context. Oh wait, what was it? What I was on something, Rhonda. I'm sorry.
No, it was excellent.
I've lost my train of thought. Oh yes, okay. So let's talk about the PR and the misinformation, disinformation.
Yeah.
So the RSF, once the war began, the RSF started positioning themselves as the people's army, the people's group. They were like, we're defending the civilians here, right? And that's what, all the PR campaigning that he started traveling around the world, meeting different diplomats, so on, presenting himself as the one defending the people. That's their position. The Sudanese armed forces, they're actually really happy about this massacre that's happening at the moment because they're now using it as a reason to say the RSF is not legitimate, the RSF should be punished, and actually we, the Sudanese armed forces, should be the one in charge, right? So you need to be careful when you hear kind of like Sudanese army officials or quote unquote government officials saying the RSF is terrible. Yes, and also understand that they are using it to reinforce their own power. They were the ones we were trying to kick out in the first place, right? So they're just repositioning themselves as like we are the legitimate, rulers, the legitimate governors. But actually, all of that is noise. In my view, and the view of lots of, civil society, is we need to come back to what the revolution was about, which is the civilian movement. Of course, that's a journey. Right. Of course, that's not super straightforward. But I think if we forget that, if we let go of that dream, then we'll just end up in the same place that we were before the revolution. And that's not a place we want to be.
And of course, I think the reason why the world's attention is or why the revolution is largely left out of the equation and what makes it so difficult for the focus to be on the agency and self-determination of the Sudanese people is the role of, proxy powers, and in particular the role of the UAE, which has been repeatedly accused of backing the RSF with money, weapons, and logistics. And broadly, for the sake of the gold markets, gold mining, smuggling, the farmlands and agriculture that you spoke to us about before, trade routes across the Red Sea. The UAE doesn't have its own gold mine, and yet it's known as the City of Gold, one of the world's largest gold trading hubs.
I wonder where that came from.
Exactly. And, Emirati companies taking large areas of Sudanese farmland to grow food for export. So they're profiting off of the Sudanese people, off of Sudanese resources. And, just can you talk us through the role of the UAE and to what extent do you think people just don't realize how much this is symptomatic of a failure or I would say deliberate ignorance about the way that Africa's resources continue to build foreign empires while African nations are left behind? So the racism that's implicit in this.
So I think it's really important for us to start to realize that the kind of politics of the 20th century are no longer the politics of the 21st century, right? The power brokers of the 20th century, they are not. It's not just, Europe, the United States, and so on. The Gulf and that kind of region is at the moment really trying to position itself as kind of like the next power. Yes, and there's other things happening, Russia, China, etc. But I often say to people, look at what's happening in Sudan to understand how politics and colonialism and warfare is going to play out. Geopolitics is going to play out in the 21st century. Why? Every power you could think of, every, major and minor power that you can think of has some sort of role in Sudan. Whether it's Turkey trying to position itself as the peacemaker, or Saudi, or Iran sending in drones, or there have been random Colombian mercenaries thrown in there, Russia's meeting both sides, Egypt is trying to back the Sudanese armed forces. Everybody has some sort of role, Qatar, etc. The United States, Europe, the United Kingdom. Let's talk about the fact that the RSF was also funded by the EU for some time because the EU wanted to stop migrants coming through. They were like, let's give a few, I think they gave like 190 million or something like that as part of something called the Khartoum process to the RSF. They're like, we're not going to ask any questions, just make sure no migrants come to our shores, right? So lots of different groups have been involved. However, if we want to start kind of narrowing it down a little bit, um, it's very important to understand that this war would not have been possible and would not have sustained itself for as long as it has if it hadn't been for the direct support of countries like the United Arab Emirates, right? And the thing about the UAE is that it wants to be a power. It's positioning itself as a sort of power broker in the region and in the world, but it's a very small place, right? It doesn't have all that many of its own natural resources. So it has to operate, kind of like the United Kingdom, a small island in the middle of nowhere that was like, in order to build wealth, we have to go out. We have to steal from others,
Yeah.
right? But and that was also in the sort of European colonial way, it was like a bit ideological and so on and so forth, this kind of idea of civilization, whatever. The UAE, it's a lot more simple. A lot of these countries, it's a lot more simple. It's the neo-colonial approach, which is we'll get what we need to look after our people, right? And so that means we'll buy up loads of land and we'll do it in such a way that it will only benefit us. It won't benefit the people that live there, right? We will not really pay attention to how something is getting to us, how the gold, how the livestock, I mean, huge amounts of livestock. Despite this entire war going on, somehow the trade routes for livestock and for gold have been untouched, right? In fact, they've gone up. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Isn't that
At the
amazing?
time
We
of
can't get
famine.
aid in.
Yeah.
There's famine. There's
Yeah.
famine. We can't get a single drop of aid in. And yet somehow you can get your gold and your livestock on time. I'm glad you can have that burger and that new necklace. But did you know whose blood is on that?
Yeah.
Right. And I think it is really useful to pay attention to how the United Arab Emirates is also responding to the current pressure. There was a brief moment early in the war where the United Kingdom, the UK, tried to say something to the UAE and they flipped. And then the UK kind of had to like really pull back because, of course, all of these Western countries they love UAE money. The UAE is investing, similar. And again, Saudi is also involved. Saudi and the RSF were quite close for some time because Saudi had actually kind of hired out some of the RSF or some of Hemeti's soldiers to fight in Yemen on behalf of the Saudis and so on. So like as mercenaries. So, there are all these sorts of things, but I think it's really interesting. And I've been thinking about why this current moment around, I think maybe what's been helpful for people in understanding what's been going on in Sudan is for there to kind of be an understandable villain, right?
Yeah.
And I think, and I understand that, right? Like there are lots of different villains, but in this case, the UAE is certainly one of the primary villains because, as I said, this war would not have been able to sustain itself if it hadn't been for their support. The question now is, can there be enough outcry and can there be enough backlash that the UAE is like, do you know what? It's maybe not worth our while. Maybe it's too, because it's not a democratic country. It's not a country where we have, as outsiders, we have any levers to influence. All we have is public opinion, right? All we have is tourism dollars. So that's why people are calling for a boycott. That's why people are calling for, outrage, because we're trying to see what ways can we influence the UAE to change its policy and for them, because I don't think they're going to make a moral decision, but for them to think maybe it's going to be too difficult for us, it's going to be too painful for us to continue supporting the RSF because of kind of the backlash that it's causing.
Yeah, well, no power has ever relinquished its privileges voluntarily. It's always had to be enforced, and you have to make what we have to do is make genocide unprofitable.
And unpalatable.
Yeah.
And the other thing on that, I think it's important to understand, like, when we talk about its connections, I have it on, I was talking to, a European diplomat who was essentially like, at the moment, like, Western leaders have kind of been like, we won't put pressure on the UAE with respect to Sudan because they're a good partner in our situation with Israel. Right. And again, understanding that all of they were one of the first, if I'm not wrong, to sign on to the Abraham Accords, right? To sort of start to normalize relations with Israel. This is all part of the deal. Sudan is just another chip in this game, right? And so that's partly why we haven't seen that much pressure on the UAE up until recently, because it's kind of been like Sudan is collateral damage as long as we can get them to help us in this other situation that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And again, when we're thinking about solidarity, the region is so connected and interconnected. None of these things happen in silos.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that because I did want to kind of end on your thoughts on the need for people to make these connections and solidarities and understand that you can't just protest for Palestine in a silo. You have to understand the way that other states are implicated and benefiting and profiting and collaborating in all of this. And Sudan and the Congo and all of these sites of oppression and massacre and genocide are all interconnected. And I think that the movement is steadily working on that kind of political consciousness, but just talk to us about two things: the need for this solidarity, and what you as a Sudanese woman and activist wants to see from people in terms of your demands and actual direct calls for action, because so many people think that solidarity is just about sharing content, and information sharing is a huge part of it. But we've seen with Palestine, we're at a point now where you know everything. You've seen everything. How many burnt children's bodies, how many decapitated pregnant women do you need to see? So there's a role, of course, for information sharing. And I think we haven't reached that point with Sudan because people have just completely closed their eyes to what's happening. But beyond that, direct action is needed. So how can people help in actual tangible ways, and how can they take action in solidarity?
So on the first question around, that solidarity piece, and around those connections, I really want to underscore that the meaning of the phrase "we're not free until we're all free," right? Because also those who seek to oppress, they look at how other people are getting away with oppression and they replicate that, right? We all know that other oppressive governments look at Israel's actions and they replicate that in their own situation. And you can bet your bottom dollar people are looking at the moment. They are looking at what the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF are getting away with. And they're like, maybe I can do that to my people. Maybe I can do that to increase my own wealth, and no one will say anything. And so it is important to understand that, like, it sets an example and it sets a precedent. And we have to all work together, because it can't just be like, okay, fine. And I understand it can be exhausting, but actually it can also be invigorating. It can also be exciting. It can be like, oh, we don't have to do this alone. We can do this with each other.
Yeah.
And that for me is inspiring, really.
There's nothing more exhausting than despair.
And doing it on your own and thinking that nobody cares, right? I think Sudanese people have been despairing because it's felt like we've been screaming into a void for 2.5 years. And, it's nice now that people are waking up. And it's also, there's an element of exhaustion because it's kind of like, oh, what does it take for our lives to be worth something? But khalas, you're here now, so like let's figure some things out. And so what is it that you can do? Well, at the moment, a lot of people are calling for people to boycott the United Arab Emirates, right? To think about not traveling there, to think about not using Emirates as your airline of choice, for example, to think about not buying gold from the UAE because it's likely gold that has been smuggled out of Sudan and its profits are going into the pockets of the RSF. So really thinking about boycotting the UAE. And I understand that, we have lots of people have family there and so on. I have family there. And talking about the UAE publicly is not always an easy or safe thing. However, as you say, power doesn't give up like willy-nilly. Nobody has ever been like, actually, yeah, no, I'm done with this oppressing now. I'm going to go off. No. So we have to hit them where it hurts. And that is money. That is profit. The other thing I will also say is, if you have the capacity to fundraise, if you have the capacity to donate, that is a huge, I cannot express how underfunded, I think if I remember correctly, the sort of UN request for aid is only a quarter funded at the moment, and we're in November. There has been absolutely no money. And at the moment, almost every single kind of community kitchen, like the way that people are being fed in Sudan is through community kitchens, through, Ahlul vibe. They're just kind of getting together and cooking for each other in war zones, in the most wild circumstances. And so many groups like the Sudan Solidarity Collective, like this, the Sudanese SAPA, which is like the Sudanese American like Doctors Association, all of these groups are on the ground delivering aid directly. And so if you have the ability to run a fundraising event or do a fundraising drive or donate even just a little bit, I know it's frustrating to ask for money, but actually that can make a huge life-saving difference at the moment for people. There are hundreds of thousands of people, probably more, who are in famine at the moment or are at risk of famine. And this is like a generational thing.
Yes.
Right? The reverberations of what's happened in this war, over 13 million children have been out of school for 2.5 years. Half the population is in need of immediate assistance, like aid assistance, food assistance, and so on. And so like being able to kind of intervene in whatever way possible, I think is like vital and actually will change people's lives, maybe save them. So those are my calls to action. One, boycott the UAE if you can. And two, if you can fundraise and donate, please do. And I guess my final one is maybe find something that's Sudanese that isn't about the war and learn about it. Whether it's Sudanese music, honestly, just go into whatever YouTube or Spotify or whatever kind of technology platform you use, whether it's music, whether it's film, whether it's art, whether it's, literature, poetry, the sports. I want you, if it's ancient history, go learn about the Kingdom of Kush. Like, take a moment to do one thing to familiarize yourself with one piece of Sudan's culture that isn't about this war, so that you can get to know us a little bit. If it's food, we love food, so try some of that as well. And I'm sure, I'm sure a Sudanese person will feed you until you're bursting for free. So yeah. Those would be my calls to action.
Thank you so much. It's just, for your time, for your generosity, your amazing intellect, your knowledge. What I'll do is I'll link some fundraising charities that you can recommend and those calls to action as well. Thank you again. So grateful to you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye, everyone.